Okay, good evening. We're the Doctors of Data, Jeff, Ashish, Jamie, and we've chosen for our project kind of a dark and hard to talk about subject, missing people. It's an area that's very close to my heart because I actually advocate on behalf of families of missing people. And one of the issues that we run into very often is a lack of good, solid, timely, reliable, actionable data to help contextualize cases individually and in a larger frame. So we want to better understand who goes missing, why, what are the circumstances, and whether there are any geographic or demographic correlations that would help us maybe help families find their missing loved ones, or maybe even help communities prevent missing cases of missing people in advance, through a little more proactive policy and engagement. So before we get into our data, I just want to ask you, just instinctively, when you hear the words missing person, what do you think of? Just shout out if anybody has any.
Kidnapped.
Okay, so kidnappings, abductions. Human trafficking. I would say we all have our own impressions based largely on what we get out of the media, whether it's the news media or the entertainment media, on what missing people look like. So I just took a brief step toward this. I just Googled the words missing person and went to Google Images, and this is what I got. So do you see any correlations between what came up in the highest level search of images for missing people? Does anything jump out at you?
Disproportionate number of females, I think.
Okay. Anything else?
Kids.
Kids. Okay. Anything else?
And very aged people.
I'm sorry?
Very aged also, other side.
Yeah. There's tends to be, I think in many, as some folks have pointed out, predominance in the perception of missing females being the ones who go missing. I think you'll see that predominantly we're looking at white females, a few women of color, a couple of guys, a lot of children. Again, this is part of the impression that we get based on hopefully your only exposure to missing persons cases is the media, but maybe not. So we just as a little bit of just give you a little glimpse into what our data showed on this score. Gender, yeah, there is support for the idea that females go missing more often than males. But when we look at ethnicity and race, yeah, a lot of white people disappear. But when we look at black, Hispanic, biracial, those numbers really stacked on top of each other would tower over. So just goes to show you, where there's this whole, this actually has a name, missing white woman syndrome, which refers to this idea that the media disproportionately focus on cases of, in missing persons cases, on that demographic, and some might say to the neglect of, willful neglect of other demographics when discussing missing persons. So to set the stage a little bit, I just want to share a little bit of information to just, again, provide some context. According to the FBI's database, NCIC, in 2016, over 647,000 new missing persons cases were added to the database during that year. Now, during that same year, over 644,000 were purged, cases were purged. So whether that was because the person came home, the person was found, remains were found, that was a bit beyond the scope of what we looked at. But you can see that a large number of these cases do get resolved at some point. Having said that, the NCIC database currently, or as of the end of 2016, contained over 88,000 unresolved cases nationally. So just gives you an idea of the scope of what we're talking about. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ashish to talk a bit about our data sources and our approach.
Thank you, Jeff. So as Jeff pointed out, definitely the subject is a little bit dark. What we wanted to point out here is, throughout our journey, how, some of the challenges that we face with gathering the data, with looking, identifying the sources, looking at the data, organizing it such that we can make it presentable, we can make it actionable. We did a lot of exploratory data analysis ourselves to weed out the things that we don't need, and we posed questions consistently to ourselves. The sources that we went with, or we started looking at, is the National Missing and Unidentified Persons, or only known as NAMUS. We also looked at the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, right? And then these data from these sources we overlaid with our census data. To organize the data, we looked at completeness of the data. Most of the data that we got would have a name, but will not have rest of the information, or they may have John Doe or Jane Doe as a name, but would not have any other information. We weeded out the outliers, filled in information that was missing, and then we honed on to we realized that the NAMUS data set was not really coming around that we can really use action, take action out of that. So we finally decided to go with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children data set. We actually developed or used one of the available, I would say, API, and we actually use it to our advantage, meaning it was not 100% complete API. We'll let Jamie talk a little bit more about it. But we developed that API and use the data. We also use Plotly, as you would see as we go around, to consider this data and plot it on the US map. Some data analysis quickly showed that the missing children database had data since 1938 through 2017. There are about 3,800, about 4,000 cases that are open since then. Now not all of them are going to be relevant. Again, we had to go through information, and there were 100 plus John Does and Jane Does which we could not identify, neither could they. Questions we were looking at, right, as Jeff posed, is like, what is happening? Is there a correlation between either demographic or geographic locations of these kids that are going missing? Right? Is it affluent neighborhoods? As you said, is abduction the major cause, or there is actually a category called runaway? Right. So this was some of the social questions we posed to ourselves, and went through, looking at the data. Quick, right off the bat, one of the other statistics that we found was there were states that were coming, based on the NCMEC database, right? If you look at count of missing people, states like California, Florida, New York, Texas, they floated on top in number of cases that were missing, right? So obvious question or obvious correlation that anybody can point out given California and Texas is population, right? We feel that there is a correlation between number of people and the children going missing. We obviously tested that and looked at the fact that that's actually not true. As you can see, we did statistical analysis on it, and it did not pan out. It did not give us any correlation between the population and the number of people, or the number of open cases, number of children that were missing. Again, the challenge became sort of wider, deeper. Right, so that's where we decided to go a little bit more deeper, and I would let Jamie take us, a little bit deeper dive.
So this graph was plotted on Plotly to give us a better understanding on the national scale. If you look on, doesn't show.
Oh.
So if you look on this graph, interactive graph that I created, the ratio scale basically means we normalize the data, so it shows if it's 35, it would be 35 people missing per 1 million people. Other than the outlier of Virginia, which it would be an interesting case to look at, we see that a lot of the data averages around 15, and it never goes past 20. And even the previous data that Ashish showed, that California and Texas were the leading candidates to look at, but we see that the actual ratio, the actual states that had a higher ratio were Nevada, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, and just at their population and income readings, we see that they don't really have a crazy correlation between each other, and they're all like kind of in the middle. So the next database, we see that it shows the NCMEC data that were given on each decade. So the first data, the first cutoff that we made were data received before 1980, and we see these small dots, but still we see a bigger dot on California and the bigger states, bigger populated states, and these are the data for 2017, and we see that even though the bigger states do still have the biggest increases, but when we calculate out each of the percentages of increases, they usually come out to be similar, around an increase by like 10 or 15, so and around that area. And so at this point, we wanted to see the data more closely within the states that we had the most data with, so like California, New York, Florida, with the biggest population, and we wanted to see the data with relations to their county at the county level. So because we didn't see a strong correlation between the population and disappearances, we wanted to see between educational level and poverty level in the most populated states. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jeff. And
Something I forgot to mention when I was talking about the NCIC data is that also in all cases of missing persons within that database, depending on how the states define juvenile, whether they define it by 18 and under or 21 and under, juveniles account for 38% or 48% of all missing persons in the nation. So we started looking at the county levels, and here we did start to see some interesting correlations. As you see, the blue line is showing household income, and so what we see as household income climbs, we tend to see fewer missing cases by county. We see the same thing when we look at Texas. We do have an outlier in one county, which would be another interesting. These outliers are, in a lot of ways, offer a rich area for future research. It's also interesting to note that it's not a straight correlation, right? You're not seeing that the poorest necessarily have the most disappearances, but there's definitely a line drawn, a point at which income, household income becomes a relevant factor. Likewise here with Florida and New York as well. Again, we've got an outlier, but for the most part, the trend holds. Illinois, same trend, and I mean, really pretty dramatic. But here's where it really becomes when we took the counties of all 5 high population states and mashed them together, and we took looked at the income. It just becomes that much clearer that there is that household income in a particular geography seems to be a stronger indicator of levels of people, children going missing. This is the by case type. Remember we asked about abductions versus runaway. Well, runaway does strongly outnumber abductions, and as we look at it by income level, we see at the low income level, high level of runaways, mid, high level, and at the higher income levels, a dramatically lower number of runaways, which again seems a very strong correlation. And I have Ashish take the next set.
So the next few slides are really similar. We are just doing more based on education, but it's very important because and the education is divided kind of into sort of bachelor's or higher and sort of prior to bachelor's. So as we go through the top 5 states, you do notice as we go higher the education, the number of disappearances, as we call them, is going lower. Again, there are some outliers, as we would want to point out. This is, by the way, this meshed up graph is deliberate to show literally all the counties coming together to kind of give everybody a perspective. This was also another really interesting finding where we can see that it's not necessary that lower the education, right? The runaways or any kind of disappearances are just flying out. There is a little bit of sort of median in here that's influencing the runaways. So that's essentially where we came out as. Lot of data we churned through, and then at the same time we wanted to make sure we give you a perspective that definitely there is a correlation or there is some kind of relationship with education, higher education. I mean, that's a social issue that everybody is aware of, income level, and then children going missing. Despite the common feeling that it's abductions, most children are sort of runaways. And then, this is how we teched out. Jamie would quickly take you through this.
So because the national databases didn't have like a well-made API that we could use, we found a person who created a web parser through the NCMEC data, and I took it and created one that would loop through all 50 states, and that's how we got all the 4,000, around 4,000 data, where we trimmed it down to 3,800. And for the census data, we used it to first get it on the national level, and then for the different state information, and then we went into the top five population data, and that's how we got our graphs. And we used Plotly for the graphs that we showed in the middle.
Great. We know I just spoke about takeaways, right? So but there is a lot to be done still, right? So we want to make sure we enrich the data set. We have actually, Jeff as well as Jamie both have applications with NCIC database, to get us access to that data. It's an FBI database. We want to cross tab missing people with ethnic groups. We want to consider, some of the media coverage as another dimension. So that there you have it. That's basically all about missing children.
Questions?
Yeah, so your presentation showed that the higher income and also higher education may have less disappearances, right? But usually higher income also have higher education. The educated people also have higher income.
Mm-hmm.
Right? How do you comment on that?
Well, that is a great point. I mean, we did find that out. Although you can see there are some outliers, right? Like, so there was Florida, there was Virginia, where we could see that there were like higher income, but does not necessarily mean higher education too, right? So the relationship is true probably just single dimension, right? One way, right? Yes, higher education may lead to higher income, right? But that was not the focus. The focus really was to look at these separately. So essentially the hypothesis there was that, if you're educated, do you think twice before committing something, before running out? Because when we found out that one of the biggest contributors to disappearances was runaways and not abductions, right? That's what led to who would be, what kind of people would really want to get out of their environment, right? Runaways would usually be caused by that. And I agree with you. It's not, although this is a scientific approach to it, the issue is still human issue, right? We want to humanize that, and that's where we went.
Could you go back to one of the graphs you have? You showed county versus household income and runaways. I think it's like the bar. Yeah, maybe if you stay there. So the hard thing for me, I'm trying to maybe go back one.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand. So you have that circle on the far right. But it does seem like in the middle there's also a comparable set. I mean, it seems like it's hard to extract the meaning from that.
That is true. Although the difference, right? So if you look at the middle, right, the household, this is in case of education, right? Where you are in the middle, right? That is, it's still lower. The jump, if you consider, right? So if you really take sort of both those levels, right? That jump is pretty significant, right? So when we were looking at it, that's where we thought of honing into.
And it's also the reason why we ended up combining all of them and then creating the bar graph to show that in the end, the higher income as well as the higher educational group did have less missing people.
Yeah, there's clearly more going on than just income and education levels, as you can see from the swings in
Correct. So
county by
Jamie,
county.
right. I mean, you know, you can argue, right? There is a little bit of effect there too.
Which is why, again, I find the outliers more interesting than the overall trend. Because, okay, we see a trend, and it's, in some sense, sort of intuitive,
Right.
that kids from poorer neighborhoods and fewer educational opportunities would be more likely to run away, get into bad circles, and come to harm. So, in those areas where the outliers lie, to me is the area that's really rich for future research.
And I believe the reason we had to combine and then to see like a more definitive result was because of our. The bigger the data is, the more the result is going to be more normalized. But since we were looking at it at a state level, and the biggest one was California, that's still like around 550 people. So just combining these states would only would give us about like 1,200 to 1,500. So if even like the graphs that you see that were only single states, maybe there's just not enough data to see like a significant amount of changes. So we
Yeah.
had to combine them.
And it was outside the scope of the data we had available, but something that I did read in reading National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's report was that they did find a high correlation of runaways among kids who had contact with legal or social services. So that's another avenue that we might want to explore further, particularly since there's also a high correlation between runaways and trafficking in the sex trade. So from a policy perspective, that may social services that are made available and the types of interactions that juveniles have with the law may be there may be strong indicators there that we want to be paying attention to.
Jeff, I have a question. I know that you came into this project with a pretty strong interest in it, and I was wondering if this project answered any vital questions you had coming into it.
Did it answer any vital questions? No, I would say I'm thrilled to know there's as much information that is more accessible than I ever realized. So it opens up a lot of doors, for me that I hadn't previously thought were going to be available, being outside the law enforcement community. But no answers yet.
All right, I want to make sure we're keeping up on time. So thank you guys.